title, Bridging the Gap Between Theory and Practice, How to Encourage Concern for Animals in Christianity Today. And just a description of what I'm going to go over in my presentation. It's a practical analysis of how best to engage in productive discourse with Christians in order to stimulate a concern for non-human animals. So this presentation is not to convince you to be Christian by any means, but it is to point out that we have a gap between what kind of conversation we're having, especially in my field in philosophy, with what sorts of arguments promoting animal liberation or promoting animal ethic will be convincing to a large number of the population. So a few preliminary notes. Around 77% of people in the United States identify themselves as Christians. This comes from Dell. And 23% identify as Catholics. And I'm going to focus on Catholicism for a significant part of my presentation because I was raised Catholic, and also a lot of the arguments about souls and whatnot originate from Aquinas, which is the Catholic tradition, but we'll see that going on a little bit through. And the second thing that we want to note is the dominant approaches, which the previous presenter just mentioned, are Regan and Singer. So within utilitarianism, we're presented with arguments about equal consideration, with rights views like Regan, Francione, Marion Warren, who gives a more weaker version of rights. We're presented with exactly that, equal rights. And this looks scary for people that are coming from an anthropocentric view like Christianity. So if we're trying to convince 77% of the population to foster a concern for non-human animals, we're not going to do so with arguments that come from Regan, that come from Singer. So I'm going to propose a better way we can approach, again, 77% of the people just within the United States. So our concern, although utilitarian and deontological theories have important contributions to make in regard to animal welfare, their practical force targets a particular audience and has limited application outside of philosophical discourse, or discussions. If we were to end the exploitation of non-human animals, we must adjust our discussions so that they engage all those who participate in the exploitation of non-human animals. So why the focus on Christianity? It's the dominant religion within the United States. And second of all, as I mentioned, it's more anthropocentric in nature than other sorts of religion, meaning human-centered. So if we look at Judaism, Islam, we're going to see more of a theocentric ideology where God is the only divine being. So not only are non-human animals are not divine, but neither are human beings. And then if we look at something like Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, we're going to see a theme of all beings are divine. So this is the one problematic religion for people who are trying to promote an animal liberationist agenda because it's very human-centered in nature. So the cause of anthropocentrism within Christianity can be attributed to this particular passage in Genesis, the first chapter. So there's two, I'm not going to read it, you can see it, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You hear the term dominion quite often. But there are two important themes that we want to look at this. We want to look at dominion, obviously, and the fact that God supposedly made man, and only man, in his image. So this can have two possible problematic interpretations that can lead to a worldview where we're essentially exploiting non-human animals. So the first has to do with dominion, and it can be interpreted in terms of despotism. So since we were granted dominion over nature, we're therefore entitled to use and abuse animals as we please. This isn't the only interpretation, and we're going to see that animal theologians contradict this interpretation, but it is a very good interpretation that Christians might use to justify what they do. And second of all, humans are made in God's image and likeness, and this goes back to the dualistic worldview that Christianity presents. So we have humans on one side, animals on the other, humans being divine, animals not. Again, another reason that's common, and I don't think it's a good reason, but it is a reason that we can therefore exploit them because they're not divine. So we have possible responses to this anthropocentric Christian worldview. The first is to return to naturalism, which we see like Nietzsche doing, Blackburn, and this is re-embracing our animality, decentering the human, getting rid of any talk about supernatural entities, and seeing humans as actually part of nature. We can elevate the non-human animal to the human level. We see this within philosophy of mind, where we start talking about the enhancing cognitive capacities of non-human animals, language, ability to engage in communication, all sorts of higher order thought sorts of thinking. And we can maybe bring some humans down to the level of non-human animals while keeping humans elevated, so just seeing an overlap between certain human beings and certain non-human animals. And we see this talk of marginal cases equating non-human animals to certain human beings. From Singer quite often is famous for that. So none of the, okay, maybe these are promising routes to go, but they're not going to be, again, very practical for converting people who are very rooted in this Western tradition of anthropocentrism, which comes right out of Christianity. So a fourth option is something that we see from Andrew Lindsay, who's the father, known as the father of animal theology, where he wants to sustain the Christian worldview, but show how we can keep talk of dominion, we can keep talk of human beings divine in the image of God, but that doesn't necessitate that we can then abuse animals. And in fact, taking biblical passages seriously actually necessitate an ethic for non-human animals. So the first thing that he looks at is this reinterpreting dominion to mean something more like stewardship. And he looks at passages like Genesis 2:15, the tilling of the garden, Genesis 1:29, where in the perfect ideal state, God commanded a vegetarian diet. It wasn't until after man had sinned, after the flood, until God allowed man to eat meat. So it's in a depraved state, but if we're looking at an ideal state, God is demanding a vegetarian diet. Deuteronomy, God demands farmers not to muzzle their ox as they look for grain, which is showing, yes, maybe we can use them to some extent, but there are some limitations on how we can do so. A quote from Proverbs, "A righteous man regardeth the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." So, I mean, we can go on and pick passages like this from the Bible that support a view that actually there is some sort of ethic that Christianity necessitates. And that might not be an extreme abolitionist ethic, but there is an ethic to some degree. We can also reject the dualistic view of human nature within Christianity. So we can look at passages within the Bible that show that animals and humans are more on the same level. So in reference to pigeons, each one is counted and known by him. And God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. From the same dust animals came, so in a sense, animals and humans are in the same sort of nature, created out of the same dust. God blessing non-human animals. At the end of the world, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion, and they're dwelling together, and a child will lead them. So we see this envision of the end of the world, not just humans, but also animals with humans as well. Okay, so given all this, we have the theoretical tools. Andrew Lindsay's not alone in showing how Christianity necessitates an ethic for non-human animals. But the question is, I don't know if there are any Christian, well, actually I have family and friends in here that are Christian, but so they might be able to answer. I don't know if anyone else is. But when did you last hear a Christian minister, pastor, or priest caution against cruelty to non-human animals? I was Catholic for many, many years of my life, and not once did I hear that in church, or did I see it in the confession booklet or anything about that. So there is this huge gap between theoretically what's there, what the potential for Christianity has, and the practicality, or seeing it actually lived out in Christians in their everyday lives. So we have a conflict, hence the title, between theory and practice. So some responses to why we might not see a practical effect or any this enforced within religious traditions or Christian traditions, churches, is first we could reject these interpretations of biblical passages because we can go back and forth about what dominion means. We can interpret it in terms of despotism.